Kaye with Dr. Kaye. I'm Kaye Wise Whitehead, and I'm delighted to be with you once again to talk about everything from politics to prose, parenting to peace studies, education to evangelicals, and Taiwan to Trump. If it is important, if it is interesting, if it is happening in your community or around the country, and if it has your ear, then it has my attention. In our second hour, it's Trending Tuesday, and we're talking about ways to change and challenge the STEM fields. Who creates apps? Who learns how to code? Who writes the program? And why does it even matter? James Baldwin once said, "It is certain in any case that ignorance, allied with power, is the most ferocious enemy justice can have." Within the last 477 days, we have had 521 mass shootings in this country. And a mass shooting is defined as either an incident involving multiple victims of firearms-related violence or an event involving the shooting, not necessarily resulting in death, of 4 or more people with no cooling-off period. We are at a moment where we must address and confront the issues surrounding gun control. It is a crisis moment. Let's just do the numbers. At this time, the UK has about 65 million people. The United States has 330 million people. The UK has approximately 50 to 60 gun homicides per year. And in the U.S., approximately 11,500. We have 5 times the population and 210 times the gun murders. Here in Baltimore City, we have about 620,000 people. And so far this year, 271 people have been killed in homicide-related murders. When do we decide, as citizens, as human beings, that enough is enough and that we have the right to be safe and to not live in fear? We shouldn't have to worry about someone walking into a church and shooting us while we're praying, driving into the side of a McDonald's and shooting us while we are eating. We should not have to worry about someone sticking a gun outside their hotel window and shooting us while we're enjoying an evening concert. White House spokeswoman Sarah Huckabee Sanders said Monday it was too soon to begin a debate on gun control. My question to her and to you, when will it be the right time? If we wait for the right time, instead of making this the right time, we will find ourselves back at this moment again, grieving, horrified, and asking the questions about gun control that only we can answer. The death toll for those killed in the Las Vegas mass shooting has grown to 59. Over 527 people thus far were injured. When is enough enough? When is the time the right time? Joining me to discuss this and other national news topics, including DACA and Don Lemon, we speak with syndicated columnist Roland Martin, author, journalist, and host of News One, now on TV One. He was named Journalist of the Year in 2013 by NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists. He was a part of National Association of Black Journalists and has still been working with them. Mr. Martin, I believe you're on the line. Thank you for joining us. He will join us shortly. We have in studio with us Dr. Robert Helfenbein. He's the Associate Dean of the School of Education at Loyola University, Maryland. Hello, Dr. Rob.
Good afternoon, and congratulations on the show.
Thank you. It's wonderful to have you here as my second guest on my second day of my first segment. How are you?
How about it? How about it?
So why don't we start by talking about the Second Amendment, and Roland Martin will join us once he gets on the phone. So the Second Amendment is designed to protect the rights of people to keep and bear arms. It was adopted back in December 15, 1791. We were a different place in 1791. We did not have 330 million citizens at that time. We did not have the kind of crimes that we see being committed today. It was a different world. Would you agree with that?
I agree.
So when we got to Sunday's mass shooting, the lead guitarist of the band that was playing, Caleb Keeter, he wrote that he's been a proponent of the Second Amendment his entire life. And until the events last night, he could not express how wrong he was. He said they had members of the crew who had handguns, legal handguns, and firearms on the bus. But having them on the bus did not help them in this crisis. So where do you stand on this issue? Should we continue to go forward, or should we begin to really challenge the Second Amendment?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is I'm not sure it's a pro or con Second Amendment issue necessarily. I mean, the question is, What do we mean when we say right to bear arms? And what we saw in Las Vegas was, and I know there's still reports coming out and we're still learning, but apparently an arsenal of automatic weapons that he had both at his home and at the hotel room. But the question is, when we talk about the right to bear arms, are we talking about the right for a full-on assault rifle? Right? Assault rifles aren't even used for hunting, right? They're designed for one thing, which is to kill people and to kill lots of people effectively. So I think one could completely be justified in defending, not saying you have to, but defending the Second Amendment within reason, right? In that you might be able to have a gun in the home, but there's limits to what that is. Now, that's one distinction. But the numbers that you lay out, I think, are just devastating. And the failure of this country to address what's actually happening related to gun violence is just unconscionable to me. But a lot of it comes down to the money, right?
Well, who has the money, who's controlling the money, and who's dealing with policies and legislation. I am someone who comes out against owning guns in the home. And I know that for some reason, has become a controversial position. I mean, one of the wonderful things about America is we can take different stands, and even if we don't agree with one another, we can agree to be disagreeable. In so many ways, right?
That's right?
I mean, this notion that disagreeable does not mean we have to slam doors. We do not have to yell. We do not have to put each other on terrorist watch lists. It just means that we're being disagreeable, which means we can be a little loud. Like, I don't mind when people get loud and passionate and angry and, completely in so many ways unreasonable, but that is okay. Like, we can still have that discussion. So you said it was okay if someone owns a gun in their home. I'm trying to figure out, like, what does that mean? What kind of world are we living in? Because if everybody owns a gun, how does that make us safer?
Well, my understanding is there are more guns than people in the United States, but it's not everybody doesn't own one. People just own lots of them. Actually, I wasn't arguing that necessarily that. I was kind of breaking down the argument that one, you could talk about Second Amendment issues and gun control without necessarily going as far as no one can have a gun. Do you see the distinction?
I see the distinction. It's going to be hard to convince me. If I look at the numbers, and I'm thinking, even if we don't look at what happened in Las Vegas just recently, I mean, I'm sure we're all grieving it, and my heart just goes out.
It's front of mind.
It's front of mind. I mean, my heart goes out to the families of the victims. I think we need to really start wrestling with what the impact is going to be of those who were left behind. If you were down on that ground, you were not shot and killed, but you were in the midst of that. I was reading reports today from people who said they helped pull people off the field. They stood with people who were crying, and they're dealing with the aftermath guilt. I mean, did I do enough? So in light of all of that, even if we took out Las Vegas, I'm still wondering if whether or not we need to begin to wrestle with this notion of gun control. When do we get to a point where we decide that living in a country where there are more guns than people does not make us safer?
I think that's exactly right. Unfortunately, I'm not that optimistic. I mean, and part of it is Sandy Hook, right? If Sandy Hook didn't do it,
yes.
I mean, an elementary school, just the complete horrific, experience. And then there's all kinds of examples. But if that didn't do it, I don't see the political will to take this on.
Now, if you're just joining us, this is Today with Dr. Kaye, and we're really trying to find a way, Dr. Robert Helfenbein and I, he's from Loyola University, we are wrestling with this notion of gun control. I mean, we're living in a city now. We're only into, October 3rd, and thus far we've had over 270 people who've been shot and killed in this city, where we're talking the numbers at 620,000 in terms of our citizens. And we're trying to figure out, when do we make the type of changes that we need to make so that people can feel safe? I don't know if having a gun, and I've never owned one, I did not grow up in a household that owned guns, I don't know if having a gun would make me feel safer.
Well, I don't know if it would either. I don't own a gun either, and in fact, what we know is guns are very, very dangerous to have in the home. The number of accidental shootings or not necessarily intended, planned out kind of murder situations is way higher, right? You're at much more risk, right, if you have a gun in the home of dying from a gunshot wound, whether it's self-inflicted, whether it's an accident, whether the intruder grabs your gun or whatever it might be. So if the outcome we're looking for is safety, that's not it.
That's interesting because back when I lived in D.C., President Clinton put forth this plan where he organized what he called AmeriCorps, which is still in existence today. But out of AmeriCorps, he had a thread called the Writers Corps program. And what he did is he chose 20 writers. And I'm not sure if he chose it, but 20 writers were chosen, 20 in D.C., 20 in New York, 20 in L.A., and he sent us out into prisons and jails and community centers to teach poetry. He was saying art could save the world. And I remember when I worked in the D.C. jail, a correctional center for women, and there were so many women who were victims of domestic violence. And there was one woman in particular, because I wrote about her, who said, if I just had a gun, I probably would have felt safer. And I'm like, would you have felt safer, or would you have been able to use that in order to take a stand so you can be safer? Like, it's really a fine line in those situations. So the gun doesn't become something that keeps you safe. The gun is what you use so you can kind of create a space of safety, which I don't know if we should change it when it comes to that. I know that it's complicated, though, right?
And
would you agree?
It's kind of a sad state of affairs that's what it has to come to, right? At least in this woman's mind, right?
Right. Well, I was thinking and looking at what the census said. The census said there are roughly 245 million adults age 18 and older in the United States. And if you multiply the adult population by the ownership rate, the gun ownership rate, that gives us between 73 million and 81 million adult gun owners in the United States. And the 5 million NRA members, National Rifle Association members, represent only about 6 or 7% of that total. 73 to 81 million adult gun owners. And yet, when you have something like Las Vegas, nobody was able to shoot back. Nobody was able to do that because they were in a situation where they were caught off guard. If you were in the church in South Carolina, someone's coming into a church and people are praying. Who takes a gun to church where you can take a stand? If you deal with the man who drove his truck on the side of the McDonald's and shot him while people were eating, well, who takes a gun to McDonald's? So even if you are a gun owner, the spaces that we're talking about, do you typically take your gun to church with you?
Well, I mean, what worries me about where that line of argumentation goes, right, is part of what's happening on college campuses right now, where increasingly they're passing open carry laws, right? Particularly in Texas, got a lot of press about that. And as an academic, and I know you're an academic and public intellectual, you may not want to admit it, but campuses are going to have to deal with this, right? Where suddenly it is legal and okay for a student to have a gun on their belt as they walk into poetry class.
Okay, so that gives me pause to concern. I actually want to open it up to our listeners. I know this is probably an issue that you think about. I'm sure it's probably an issue that you're wrestling with, particularly in light of our current numbers here in Baltimore City. I want to hear from you. Give me a call at 410-319-8888. Let's talk about it. What should we do in Baltimore City? Because even though when a mass shooting happens, something doesn't change on the national level, but on the local level, you see changes. I mean, I'm thinking about Sandy Hook, that right after Sandy Hook, a number of elementary schools, and folks know that I'm a mom, so I remember the changes in my son's school. They enacted all of these barriers so you couldn't get into the school. So before Sandy Hook, I could take my youngest son, Amir, and I could walk him all the way to his classroom. And I would hang out a little bit, and I would say hi to the other little kids. And I remember that there were parents all over the building, but these are people that I thought were parents. Let's be clear. I don't know. But I thought they were parents like me, just dropping their kids off. And I remember after Sandy Hook, and that I was so sad about what was going on. And I was afraid for my own sons here in Baltimore City in their school. The next day when I went to their school, the door was now shut. You had to be buzzed in. You had to state why you were coming. They had people there. You can drop your child off with us. We'll walk them to the classroom. That they were really preventing people from having that kind of access. So although the policies didn't change, we saw changes on the local level.
But again, what a sad state of affairs, right? I mean, one of the things we know about effective schools is that they're much more open, welcoming places. I understand why folks responded in that way, and I can't really pass judgment, particularly in the immediate aftermath of that. But I'm concerned that schools as part of the public fabric ought to be open places where parents can come and check out what's happening in my child's class.
Yeah, I don't know. Don't they have something? I was reading, and I was reading an article about China, that there are classrooms in China now where they just set the cameras up. That if you want to see what's happening in your child's school, you just simply log on. We don't need you in the building. You can just simply log on and see what's happening, which sounds a bit intrusive for my oldest son who's in 11th grade. But when my son was in 3rd grade, why couldn't I watch and see what was going on? I actually want to, all right. So why don't we just stop it here just for a moment? We're going to go to a break, and when we come back, we're going to open up the phones, and we'll be joined by Roland Martin. You can call us at 410-319-8888. Where do you stand on gun control? How do we make some changes in this city and make them now? This is Today with Dr. Kaye. Stay with us. Welcome back to Today with Dr. Kaye. So we're talking about gun control. We're talking about what happened in Las Vegas. We're also going to get into dealing with what the after effects of that is, the physical pain, the emotional toil, even the financial impact of being one of the victims, and you were in this mass shooting and you survived, and you have to deal with everything that comes after that. We're being joined now by syndicated columnist Roland Martin, author, journalist, and host of News One Now on TV One. Hello, Roland Martin. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Fine. I'm so glad that you have joined us. I'm still in the studio with Dr. Robert Helfenbein, who's the Associate Dean of the School of Education at Loyola University, Maryland. So, Roland, I'm actually going to come to you. We've been talking about the Second Amendment, and we've been wrestling with whether or not guns are making us safer. I wanted to have you weigh in on when do you think we should have this conversation about gun control?
Actually, I'm not interested in a conversation on gun control, because we've been having conversations about gun control, and then that's the problem. Well, we've had nothing but conversations, we have not had action. The reality is this here. America needs to confront, and I talked about this in my Roland Martin Unfiltered podcast last night. We have to deal with this reality that America was founded upon violence. America committed violent acts against Africans. America committed violent acts against Native Americans. America was created by virtue of the gun. We must deal with that. America has this sick fascination with guns. To understand how pervasive guns and violence is, think about it in terms of, for so many years, if you were a kid, I remember it. I have a photo of when I probably was 5 or 6 or 7 years old of getting a gun set, cowboy belt.
I remember those.
Holding it up. Same thing. And so when you talk about other sort of guns, I mean, so from the beginning, that's what we ingrained in the minds of young folks in this country, in this whole deal. Now, let me be clear. There are people out there who come from different parts of the country where hunting is a natural part of their life. And I get that. But a lot of us don't live in the country. A lot of us no longer live in that situation. I remember talking to Charles Cobb, one of the student nonviolent courtroom committee leaders. And he said he wrote a book called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. He talked about the role that guns played in self-defense for black people. He said one of the first things that when he went to Alabama, and when they went to these rural parts of Alabama, and one of the sharecroppers, the first question one of these black sharecroppers said, "Son, where's your gun? Can you shoot a gun?" Because they said, look, we can't call the cops. That was a different type of protection. And so we must psychologically deal with, why is America so fascinated and why is it so ingrained to have guns in our society? That is what drives everything. We have romanticized the gun without acknowledging that it is a killing weapon the way it is being used. Either self-inflicted wounds or when people shoot one another.
What's interesting is that when you talk about romanticizing this notion of gun violence, we see it in all of our movies. We see it in video games where people are being shot and killed, but they're just characters on a screen. That helping young people to make the connection that one is just a game and one is real life seems to be a huge disconnect. And that is what we're feeding our young people.
Well, we also have to recognize what that gun symbolizes. It symbolizes power. And let me break it down this way. What does America say to the world? America says we are the biggest and the baddest nation on the planet. If you do anything to America, we will kick your ass. I'm using that language for a reason. Mm-hmm. That's what America says. America says no one can mess with our army, our Navy, our Marines, our air power. America is considered the greatest superpower, not because of our economic wealth, but because of our military. So what have we done with that? We have sent the signal to everyone that who we are and why we are so tough, why we're so bad, is because of our military. And so we get off on that. We thrive on that. I mean, and so then what happens is you take that, and then what do we want to have? A show of force, a show of power when it comes to our local police. And so you take all of that. But I'm going to take you back to a movie called Grand Canyon. Wasn't the greatest movie in the world, but there was this wonderful scene that opens the movie up. And Danny Glover plays a truck driver. And God, his name was in my face. I can't think of it right now, but he plays, it was a rich white man, and his Mercedes breaks down. He calls the tow truck driver, and Danny Glover shows up. And then what happens is this group of thugs pull up, and they're going to jack homeboy's car. And Danny Glover said, look, man, y'all need to go, leave the man alone. I'm going to take his car away. The brother said, he said, let me ask you a question. Would you be showing me this level of respect if I didn't have this gun? Yep. Danny Glover says, you already know the answer to that question. So the gun also symbolizes power. And so that's why individuals who are 5'2", 5'3", feel like they're 6'8", 280 pounds when they have that gun.
Well, let me see if I can. I want to just pull Dr. Helfenbein in here, because this notion of the ways that we romanticize the gun. Mm-hmm. If you can chime in on that, Dr. Helfenbein, and how that's taught through education, because that's also one of your fields of expertise. How are we feeding this information to young children? You're talking 6 and 7 and 8 years old around this.
Well, I think he's exactly right. I mean, that history is clear, and there's some historians that have written about that. I think there's a book called The Republic of the Gun, or something, History of Violence. There's a couple volumes there that are written about exactly what Mr. Martin's talking about there. And it is deep. It is deep, and it's cultural. But, another example I might give is go into any bookstore, right, in this country. How do we divide our history? We divide it by war.
Yep.
Right.
Right.
Go into Barnes and Noble. See how they break up the section on history. It's by war. So we have conceived of ourselves in that particular way, and it would be a pretty radical cultural shift to move against that. Now, that does bring an educational question, right, to the fore. Is how are we teaching our own history? How are we coming to terms with our own history, with our young people in classrooms all across this country? And what you can find is probably not something you would be surprised by, right, is that we divide our history textbooks up by war as well, and we teach our history in terms of war. And it's very rare that we have any kind of alternative perspective on how to lay that history out, right, or even to talk about resistance, right, kind of in the name of justice as a front-loaded set of concepts, right, instead of one war following each war.
Well, let me bring our callers into here.
And you got to remember something here, because, again, this is why history matters. What do we say to everyone in the world? Americans, the new frontier, how we expanded out west. But we don't want to say how we did that.
Right.
We don't want to say who we killed to make that happen. Same thing right now when you talk about history. You see, Las Vegas the worst mass shooting in American history. No, it's not. The Americans will tell you what happened in the 1890s when 300 were killed. When you had anywhere from 60 to 100 black folks who were killed in near Tulsa, Oklahoma. When you have upwards of 300 to 800 black people who were killed in other massacres. All this is important because what we have to understand is America now says, oh, we're not even going to count the massacre of Native Americans and black folks.
That's not included in the history.
Because that wasn't mass murder. That wasn't mass shooting.
No.
You know what that was? That was law and order.
That was law and order. That was about going west and taking over the land. I do want to, Mr. Martin and Dr. Robert, I want to bring in the callers. I have Jerome on from Baltimore. Jerome, welcome to Today with Dr. Kaye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaye. As I was saying, I agree with what Mr. Rowland is saying right now. The gun has been used as a tool to really bully and to make people back off of you. Like I was saying to you earlier, I am the first generation off the farm, and a gun in our house was no big deal. You had a gun to go hunting, used a gun to if any of the animals went bad, you used the gun for that. It wasn't there to hurt or to try to kill somebody unless somebody was trying to do harm for you or steal from you. And really, in most cases, you didn't even have to do that because you knew who the people were, so you could come to some type of resolution to solve the problem. If there was a need or something, you could have it. But today, what I see in the city is that a lot of people are using a gun in a way to finish their anger, and they're not really understanding, or they don't have the knowledge to understand what it's really there for. They do not have the knowledge of really life. They don't. The education has lacked so much of it, taking that part of it. And as you were saying, in the early years when the settlers first came here, and how they just overwhelmed the country with the gun.
Oh, I definitely agree with what Jerome is saying. It's just kind of pulling together what you were arguing, Roland, this idea that we don't talk about the number of Native Americans who were slaughtered as we were taking over land. No. We don't talk about the number of black folks who were killed in different places all over the country. We're only counting certain numbers of people who actually we say matter. So those numbers actually mean something. Well,
first of all, I'm going to say it. In America, we only believe white folks matter. And the thing, and here's the danger, and let me bring it present day. Just look at what Donald Trump tweeted a few days ago.
And the difference between that and his Charlottesville tweet.
No. I'm going to take another direction. He tweeted that it was a waste of time for his own Secretary of State to be involved in diplomacy with North Korea.
Oh, we're going in a different direction.
No, it's the same direction. Because this is what Donald Trump is saying. What he's saying is conflict resolution, talking it out, is not going to solve a thing. I'm impatient for that. We're going to blow you up. Now, bring that thing to the classroom. Oh, we can't resolve our conflict by talking. What I'll do is I'm going to shoot you. And I want people to understand that this thing is even deeper when you talk about educationally. But what if we go to our base level? This actually happened. Last year, I was at a Texas A&M football game, and I'm an Alpha, life member, and I was a brother who went to Texas A&M, was a Kappa. And so he's walking across the field at halftime, and he starts trying to make some jokes about Alpha. And I said, bro, you don't want none of this. I said, because it's not going to end well for you. I get paid to talk. So he walks off. So when the game was over, we were in the locker room area, and so he begins to jog in. I said, bro, you don't want to play the Greek dozens with me because it's not going to end well for you. He kept running his mouth. So we started joining, dozens, playing dozens. I'm destroying him. I mean, I'm talking about his friends are laughing at him. I'm destroying him. And then he goes, but I bet you're going to vote that light. I'm going to kick your ass. I said, wait a minute, hold up. You're a college-educated man. I'm a college-educated man. We're cracking jokes about one another, about our fraternities, But because I'm whooping your behind verbally,
you're ready to do it
now
physically.
want to- physically. So think about that. So what happens is we cannot accept losing, so therefore we respond with violence.
Well, now, Roland, I'm going to stop you just there so we can take a quick break.
That's the problem.
Well, we're going to take a quick break here. If you're just joining us, it's Today with Dr. Kaye, and we're talking about gun control. When we come back, let's talk about the lone wolf theory. Why is it that when white men, who are the biggest contributors to this idea of mass shootings, when they do it, they act alone? When someone else does it, of a different race, they're speaking for the entire race. We're going to talk about it when we come back. Welcome back to Today with Dr. Kaye. We are talking about gun control. We're here with Roland Martin and Dr. Robert Helfenbein, and we are trying to break down the ways in which we understand power, guns, and violence in this country. Let's talk about the lone wolf theory. Sean King from the New York Daily News wrote that we are witnessing the blatant fact that white privilege protects people like Stephen Paddock, an alleged mass murderer, not just from being called a terrorist, but from the anger, rage, hellfire, and fury that would surely rain down if he were any other person of a different race or different religion in this country. His skin color protects him. So how does race play into this latest crisis? Dr. Helfenbein, I'll come to you first.
So I think it is interesting, and I think there is a tendency to bandy around terms, certainly that is problematic. But there does seem to be some kind of excuse making that happens for white folks when they engage in these types of crimes, and I think it has everything to do with kind of racial conceptions, and certainly part of what Roland Martin was talking about earlier, and the way we perceive people of color as members of this society. Although I will point out that if you track some of the news stories today, one of the things that was interesting was how the so-called alt-right was trying to paint Mr. Paddock as part of Antifa and a Bernie supporter. And
he was an Obama lover. I heard that.
Right. So it was, and they were way off, like on all kinds of facts. They even had the wrong name, I think, at first. But it was interesting how they were trying to use this for political advantage right off the bat, right, by painting him in this particular way.
Roland, let me hear from you. So we're looking at the fact
that first of all, okay. This is very simple. We are a white-dominated country. Our banks are dominated by whites. Our school system dominated by whites. 70% of the people who voted in the last presidential election were white. You look at every facet of America. When you say America culture, that means white. And so everything is done through the prism of white folks. The reason white America is unsettled by what is happening today, which is the reason why Donald Trump is in the Oval Office, is because of white fear, because we are a changing country. Why are white folks so protective of Confederate monuments? Because that means that people of color are rising up and assuming numerical power, and we're saying, oh, the symbols y'all white folks put up, we know they're BS, and now we are now mayors and vice mayors and council members. We now have power to remove them. The same thing here. Media, white. Okay? The people who make the decisions, white. And so when they see a Stephen Paddock, they see brother, uncle, they see cousin, they see husband. And so, but when it happens to one of us, they see, in essence, foreigner, outsider, not one of us.
Threat,
and so as
criminal.
A result, every Muslim has to apologize and condemn an action of one Muslim. Black folks have to do the exact same thing. White folks yell black on black crime. When is the last time you heard them even utter the phrase white on white crime? So what has happened is, in American society, pathology, negative things have been assigned to non-white people. Black person commits a crime. We want to examine, was their daddy at home, what their mama was doing. A white person does something bad. We go, oh, it was just them. You can't blame their mother. Look at the stories. This guy loved country music. He loved gambling. I'm sorry. They are literally humanizing a domestic terrorist when we know doggone well you would not see those same stories if it was a Muslim or an African American or an undocumented worker who actually committed an atrocious act such as this.
And they are humanizing him in such the same way in which they dehumanize black people who are victims of police brutality. They dehumanize the victim.
Because they see that person as someone who they know, they grew up with, they went to school with. It is look, when I worked in Fort Worth, Texas, and a number of years ago when I was a City Hall reporter, there were 2 white girls who were killed, found in a car in this weeded lot. And all of the stories for 3 and 4 days, the glowing photos and how they had a promising future. And then on the 4th day, we discovered it was a drug deal gone bad. Then they discovered a lesbian sex ring. And then they discovered cult. All of a sudden, it all changed. And people went, wait a minute, what happened? It's because the editors of the paper, they saw them as their daughter, as their nieces.
They humanized them.
Wives.
Yes.
That's the difference. And that's why you have the disparate coverage, the focus, because they simply don't see us as them. They see us as other.
Well, let me get in one of our callers. Dr. Rao is calling from Baltimore. Welcome to Today with Dr. Kaye.
Hey, it's good to have you in the Morgan family, Dr. Kaye.
Thank you.
Truly enjoying this conversation. One of the things I think we should add, we talk about white privilege. And one of the areas where that manifests itself is when you look at access to guns. Oftentimes, those who create access to guns in the urban environment are, in fact, white dealers who operate out of the trunks of their cars. But you don't see any type of serious punitive actions taken against those persons who actually provide access of guns to the community. The same thing with immigration. I mean, we talk about illegal immigrants, but yes, it is the persons, if they could not find a job, somebody's hiring them. What are the punitive actions taken against the persons who are hiring them? So the is focusing on the making all of us the victims and not focusing on those who perpetrate and who actually create access and allow some of the things that they are, quote unquote, uncomfortable with. But they create it, and they create laws so that these persons aren't punished. But just the last comment is, Martin, you're so right on, and the guest, it is part of our culture. Violence is a part of American culture. Until we can say that, and we can say it out loud, we are a violent nation, then we cannot pursue any avenues of trying to resolve this. But we have to call ourselves who we are. And that's what's not happening in society. We're not admitting that we are a violent nation.
Well, thank you so much.
We can't resolve it.
Thank you, Dr. Roll. I really do appreciate you kind of chiming in and adding that. I want to come back to you, Dr. Robert. If you can just kind of talk a little bit about the ways in which we can push this country to have an honest conversation about what so many white men are doing. We know the facts. The majority of mass shootings in this country are committed by white men, and yet we are reluctant to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. How do we push them to do that?
Well, let me say something first that I've been thinking about as we have this conversation here is, what just happened in Baltimore was the Baltimore ceasefire. And I know a lot of folks that think that was just posters up in windows and a slogan. But in fact, I know some of the folks that were organizing that in the city of Baltimore. And what they were doing was going corner to corner across that whole weekend, trying to de-escalate conflict, right? And using some skills on conflict resolution to try to prevent gun violence. And I, in some of the coverage, I felt like that certainly got underplayed. There are community-based organizations that are deeply engaged in trying to cut down the amount of violence and gun violence in particular in their communities. And it's impressive. So I don't want to paint a picture that there aren't people trying to make this culture shift, right? And they're doing it in their own communities, their own blocks. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. to your question, it's true. I said this back in the in the first, or actually in the as we started the war in Afghanistan, right? Is Timothy McVeigh at that time had blown up the Oklahoma City bombing, but we didn't go and level his neighborhood, right?
Right. No. But we didn't go and we didn't unleash the kind of terror and fury that we rained down. I mean, I think of places like Rosewood in Florida, a place that was burned to the ground. Of course, this is in the 30s and 20s and 30s, a place that was burned to the ground because there was a concern and there was a notice that people had gone out that a black man had raped a white woman. Of course, it was found to be untrue.
Well, first of all, you don't have to go to. You don't have to go to Rosewood. Go to what happened in Philadelphia with MOVE.
Oh, with the MOVE incident. I was in college then.
Look, and that was under a black mayor.
Yes, it was.
But again, but I need people to understand. And Doc, please finish your point about this real quick. You have to remember, it doesn't matter even if you have a black mayor, when you have a politically powerful position, but you still are operating within a white construct, what America says, the end result, how do we, Doc said, conflict resolution, how do we end it? America says violently. We don't believe in the concept of walking away. We say, at the end of the conversation, you either going to do it, or I'm going to beat you, I'm going to shoot you, I'm going to blow you up. That is the American way.
And that is something that we are wrestling with and trying to think about. I want to just let our listeners know, Rosewood, when it was burned down, that was 1925, and the MOVE incident happened in 1985. So if people want to go look up what happened with MOVE, when we really dropped a bomb, of course, on an American neighborhood in Philadelphia, and then the after effect of that, and everyone who died, and then, of course, the one person who lived, and how we still haven't wrestled with what that means for us to go after certain American citizens. And this is what Dr. you was saying, Roland Martin. Certain American citizens are the ones who are considered to be disposable, that we can unleash fury on them. And there's certain American citizens. I'm thinking about Dylan Storm Roof. There's nothing more clear in my mind was after he terrorized that community and murdered 9 people after praying with them for over an hour. The fact that they would give him the bulletproof vest, and let's talking about feeding him. Like humanizing him, calling him a child in ways that Tamir Rice, who was shot and killed in the park, playing by himself, was not. So, Roland, I want to ask you, as we begin to transition just a little bit, and talk about Don Lemon. I know this is a much lighter conversation, lighter in the sense that the Las Vegas massacre that just occurred is very heavy on our hearts. It is not a serious issue. It's just a little bit light. I'm thinking about Don Lemon's comments last week in light of what's been happening with the Colin Kaepernick take a knee. It started with taking a knee during the playing of the national anthem. Well, first he was sitting down. Then he took a knee to really speak out in a very quiet way against police brutality. Now it's of course, spun off into a number of different things. When Don Lemon made his comments, and we have a clip from Don Lemon. Why don't we go to the clip first, and then we'll talk about on the other side, did he have anything to lose by taking this stand?
So we're going to start by setting the record straight here. Taking a knee at an NFL game was never about the flag or the military. That's what the president wants you to believe. It gives his insulting sons of bitches comment cover. A comment that not only insults hardworking professional men, but tries to drag their mothers down to his level as well. Taking a knee is a constitutionally protected expression. It falls within league rules, period. If anyone actually believes this is about the flag, then you must believe Rosa Parks' protest was about a bus. Think about that. Here's what this is about. It's about focusing attention on racial injustice. Focusing attention on racial injustice. It's about challenging our country to extend the promise of that flag to all citizens, including the citizens whose ancestors were slaves. You may not agree with Colin Kaepernick or the scores of players who take a knee or took a knee this weekend, and that is okay. You don't have to agree with them. But that's not really the point here. No American gets to tell another American how to express their love for this country. Now let's talk about patriotism. What is it? Is it draping oneself in the flag? Is it the pageantry and spectacle of a ball game, standing up for the national anthem? Or is it standing up for the founding principles of this country? standing up for the very First Amendment of our Constitution, the very first one, which is freedom of expression. Standing up for our...
So this idea that we're wrestling with the notions of patriotism, about the First Amendment, who has the right to protest, how protest is seen to be acceptable when certain people are doing it. Roland Martin, we have talked a lot about the take a knee that's taking place, but I just wanted to kind of hear from you where we should go with it now.
Well, I think first off, what we're seeing is an unwillingness by external forces to follow the lead of the player. This is what I mean by that. For the life of me, I do not understand why last week, 2 weeks ago, 4 NFL players released a 10-page memo, very detailed, about what they wanted to see next.
Right. That
was pretty much ignored by media. Then, of course, Trump makes his comment, then it blows up. What I don't understand is why I have not seen a news conference of the NAACP, the National Urban League, Reverend Sharpton, Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., labor organizations, leadership conference for civil rights, HRC, and others.
Right.
Standing together and saying, we are going to use the force of our organization to push the agenda of these players while they are working internally. Because what these players need is they need somebody, other forces to show we've got your back. So we also got to remember, they are there to play football. They are using that stage and that platform to raise the awareness to these issues. But this is not what they do 7 days a week. And so I don't understand why the collective civil rights infrastructure has not stepped up and done this. Yes, there have been individual statements. Yes, there have been individual interviews, things along those lines, but I'm speaking as a collective. What we also have to understand is this here. We just said it. White is right in America. You have never seen a protest involving black people that white folks have ever fallen in love with. This is American history.
Right.
When black newspapers during World War II were demanding the double V campaign, it was victory abroad and victory at home.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The Department of Defense literally was going to shut down black newspapers because they were reporting on incidents of segregation among black troops in the military. They threatened to shut down Robert Sinspec and the Chicago Defender.
Yep.
America, I need people to listening understand this. Ethan McKaylee breaks this thing down in his book on the Chicago Defender. I was a former executive editor of the Chicago Defender, and so I know this history very well. The United States literally was going to shut down multiple black newspapers because they dared write about segregation and racism within the armed forces because they said, you are not being a good American. Keep the focus on Mussolini and Hitler and not on our troops.
And I think we're seeing some of that today. I'm thinking about Jamila Hill and the attack by the president on her.
It's the same.
It is the same. It is the same.
Steve Smith, a white Republican, went on MSNBC, seated right next to Harold Ford, and said, let me say this, Donald Trump is a racist. That did not cause a ripple. Yet, and then I even challenged media writers to say, wait a minute.
Yes.
Why was it a huge story when Jamel Hill called him white supremacist? They tried to say, well, it's because she's in sports. I said, no, wait a minute. Are y'all saying this? So literally, this black woman calls Trump a white supremacist, all hell breaks loose, yet a white man who is a Republican, who ran John McCain's 2008 campaign, called Donald Trump a racist, and it was no big deal. That is what we call whiteness at work.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, and we're going to pick that up. We are definitely going to talk more about whiteness at work, more about white supremacy, more about white privilege. We'll have Roland Martin back with us again. Dr. Robert Helfenbein, thank you as well for joining us. This is Today with Dr. Kaye here on WEAA 88.7 88.9 FM. After the break, STEM grads are projected to earn class of 2016's highest average starting salaries. So how do you get into the field and make this kind of money? Well, it's Trending Tuesday, and we're talking about STEM, so join us at 410-319-8888. Tweet us at @KWhitehead, or send me an email at todaywithdrk@gmail.com. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back to Today with Dr. Kaye. We're here discussing everything from politics to prose, parenting to peace studies, education to evangelicals, Taiwan to Trump, and now we're talking about STEM. If it's important to you, if it's interesting, if it's happening in your community or around your country and mine, and if it has your ear, then it has my attention. So what is Trending Tuesday? And our topic for today is women in STEM. And STEM, of course, stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. We're going to get into a conversation about how do we get young boys and girls of color to be interested in getting a job in the STEM field and in majoring in STEM. Does it have to do with the type of toys we give them? How early do we introduce that chemistry set and we change the whole idea that it's a nerd at work? Joining me in the studio to talk about it is Renetta Toll. She's Associate Vice Provost for Strategic Initiatives of the Graduate School at UMBC, College of Engineering and Information Technology. Hello, Dr. Toll. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Dr. Kaye. Thank you for having me.
We also have on the phone is Dr. Frances Carter Johnson, Education Data Scientist with training in physics, mechanical engineering, policy research, and evaluation, and she's with the National Science Foundation. Dr. Carter Johnson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Kaye, for having me.
And we also have by phone Dr. Kelly Cross. She's a research scientist in the bioengineering department, and she's out at Illinois University. Hello, Dr. Cross. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Kaye.
So now, by way of full disclosure to our listeners, I invited a panel of all black women in STEM who are super smart and who are doing the type of things that I have always wanted to do and dreamed about from afar. Engineering, mechanical engineering, bioengineering. I don't know what any of this means as a humanities person, but they're going to talk about this. I'm going to come to you first, Dr. Carter Johnson, because according to the National Science Foundation, just 66 women received their physics PhDs during the 39 years between 1973 and 2012. And if you break those numbers down even farther, between 1973 and 1994, only 14 women in the United States received a PhD in physics. Why do you think there's such a gap in these numbers?
Between black women and black men, black men and black women and white men would be the question, the gap that you're specifically speaking about?
Yes, that's the gap.
Physics is the extreme example, I guess, if you would think about about STEM as a continuum. Physics is probably your most extreme example, math and physics. And unfortunately, there have been traditionally expectations that women and minorities can't really do physics. And for me, you introduced me by saying that I have degrees in physics. I do. I have an undergraduate degree in physics and 2 master's degrees in physics. But I fell in love with physics as the first science I loved in high school, in boarding school in Mississippi at a math and science school for academically gifted students. I didn't like biology. I didn't like chemistry, but I loved physics. But everybody encouraged me not to do physics because everyone thinks physics is extremely hard. When I realized that I could do physics as a little black girl from Mississippi, I was one of those people that wanted to get a PhD in it because I felt if I could learn it, then anyone could learn it. But as I went through basically got to the master's degree in physics, it's not an inviting place. It's an abstract place to work and to think. And it requires, I think, some resilience, some very strong resilience. So the women, those 14 black women that do have those PhDs in physics, and I know many of them, they're extremely resilient. And I think that's, I don't know if we can teach resilience as we think on your radio show about how to increase these numbers, but that's kind of my take on why there are some of the gaps are there.
Now, Dr. Cross, in 2012, black women took home a total of 684 STEM degrees, and that's in science, technology, engineering, and math. But Dr. Cross, look at this. For white women, the number was 6,777, and for white men, the number was 8,478. Can you speak to this racial disparity, and how do we close that gap?
Well, I would suggest closing that gap, just kind of counter to my colleague on the line, Dr. Carter Johnson. I don't think that teaching resilience is the thing, because that gap has persisted over time. I think that we need to look critically at the institutions where these actually happen. And from a critical race theory, I think we need to start challenging some of these biases that have persisted historically. And so when we look at the gap, particularly with engineering, those gaps persist and they get worse as you go through the pipeline. And that speaks to systemic problems and, as she mentioned, the unwelcoming climate, as opposed to that these students are insufficient or these students are not necessarily smart enough or strong enough to complete a program. That's just not true.
Dr. Toll, I want to come to you now because we know that misogyny and racism are present, even at the highest echelons in these fields. I'm thinking about in 2015 when Nobel laureate Sir Tom Hunt, and he was at a gathering of the World Conference of Science Journalists, he stated that he did not like working alongside women because he found them emotional, and they constantly fell in love with their male scientists. Now, I know some of the work that you do, Dr. Toll, and I want to have you talk about that, but what you do is you work with small cohorts of men and women, but women in particular, to help them build up their resilience and their power to kind of finish their PhD programs. Can you talk about the Promise program and what you do there?
Sure. The Promise program is an AGEP program, Alliances for Graduate Education in the Professoriate. It's sponsored by the National Science Foundation, and there are several of these AGEP programs around the country. We have one here in Maryland that includes the University System of Maryland, and we have some subsets that are going to be including Morgan State, Johns Hopkins University, College Park, UMBC on the engineering side. And so with these programs, we try to look at holistic professional development to make sure that people are thinking about family, that they understand issues related to even domestic violence and sexual harassment. And that's one of the issues that we have to think about in terms of bringing up women who are going to be in STEM fields, letting them know that they can resist some of the issues that come across from their male counterparts, but also training the men. This is a big thing that we're starting to do to make sure that our male students, recognize what is unacceptable, what is considered abusive, what is considered inappropriate, even when it comes to joking and those things. When they have to stand up against other males, when there are things that are either said or done inappropriately to women who are in the lab with them or women who are their counterparts in science and research. And so it's a sort of a dual process where we're working with both the women and the men to make sure that everyone sees it as an equal playing field and a place where everyone belongs. And the Promise program is one of those places where publicly we start to talk about this.
Well, I want to open it up to everyone now, and I'll start with Dr. Carter Johnson and have you all kind of tell a bit about your story. Dr. Carter Johnson, could you talk to us a little bit about perhaps some of the misogyny or racism that you found with the NSF, and then ways that you have been able to work around it, to work through it, and ways that you would help women build up their resiliency in coming into this very male-dominated and very white-dominated field? Dr. Carter Johnson?
You're specifically asking about misogynistic or racist experiences that I've had at the National Science Foundation?
Yes, and have you, and I'm just assuming you may have had maybe one. Have you found that? And if not there at the NSF, how about coming through this particular field? And you are a black woman, you have a BA in physics, you have 2 master's degrees in physics, and these are male-dominated fields. How do you work through these things?
Well, I guess the most prominent example, the example that touched me the most was when I did not yet have my PhD. I think something about the confidence after, for me, receiving my PhD, it seemed like some of the negative experiences haven't touched me as hard. But as a master's student working on my first master's, there were professors in the department. I was doing my master's at Mississippi State University. I am a native of Mississippi. I graduated from the boarding school in Mississippi for our best students. But there were professors who would not even speak to me when I walked down the hall in the physics department, and I was never told. I didn't realize it until I graduated. But from Mississippi State University, I was the first black person to get a graduate degree in that department. Everyone else had attempted but not completed, and people did not speak to me until I began to make A's and B's in my classes, and until I won a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. When I won that fellowship, after being in that department for a year and a half, people that had never spoken to me came up to me to speak to me.
Now, Dr. Cross, I know you have recently won quite a few grants and fellowships. Can you talk a little bit about that and about the work you do? Because in the bioengineering field, I'm sure it's even more isolating for women in particular, but black women and more specifically.
Yeah, and in full disclosure, I am not technically a bioengineer. That just happens to be the department in which I work. I'm actually technically trained as a chemical engineer, but in terms of my research...
I'm just going to cut in for a second, Dr. Cross. For some of us lay folks here, I'm not even sure what the difference is between chemical engineering and bio. So I'm going to be very transparent. It all sounds the same to me.
Okay, thank you for stopping me. Sure. Chemical engineering, and this is a lot of the work that I have done in terms of working with doing any sort of outreach, is because most of us are not born into families with engineers, and so we really don't understand what engineering is to begin with. And so chemical engineering specifically is about mass production of something.
Okay.
So, for example, chemical engineers, we design plants to make food. We design to make the water or whatever soft drink that you like. So, for example, we would make where a chemist would make this is the recipe to make this particular drug. The chemical engineer is the one that says, okay, I need to make 20 million pounds of that.
Okay.
So it upscales the chemistry, right? And then bioengineering is really a young field in engineering, counter to physics, which has been around forever. Bioengineering is a combination of biomedical science, but then also applying engineering to those to the medical field. Is in short a short description of what bioengineering is. So it's the whatever engineering principles that we can apply to medicine and healthcare and all of the related fields to that, right?
Okay,
so,
now that's very interesting. So the work you do and the fellowships you've gotten have been in bioengineering or in trying to connect this out into the general public?
Yeah, and so my work is really around how we educate engineers.
Okay.
And so my work is tied to bioengineering. For example, I do work around looking at stress and what sort of cultural things allow women of color. For example, I have a study looking at the experiences of women of color in engineering, and so I look at what factors either allow them to excel or kind of hinder their progress. And what we have found thus far is that it is related to microaggressions, it's related to unreported, undiagnosed stress and anxiety that prevents them from matriculating, which kind of goes back to my original comment that we need to start looking at the environment in which we're educating these students and what environment are we bringing them into. And so because when we're talking about mental health, which that's kind of the ugly thing that engineers don't really like to talk about, but there is this sort of shaming of that if you don't make it in engineering, it's because you have some flaw. And I am very much opposed to that sort of epistemology, and I'm working to really dismantle that within my discipline and in engineering more broadly. So the work that I do, and tying that to bioengineering, just finish, is we can look at biological markers for that. So, for example, students can have monitored that something that they can attach to their finger and monitor their heart rate or their pulse to indicate that they are at a high anxiety level or that their stress is up. And so that's kind of the work that I do.
Well, if you just joined us, this is Today with Dr. Kaye, and I'm here speaking with three doctors, Dr. Renetta Toll, Dr. Frances Carter-Johnson, and Dr. Kelly Cross, Black women in STEM and STEM-related fields, either with degrees in STEM or actually working at the National Science Foundation. And they're talking now about the misogyny and racism. They're talking about the ways in which we help people through these programs. And I want to come back to you, Dr. Toll, because programs meant to encourage women in STEM actually might be backfiring, because it's not the women who need to change. It's the actual field and the pervasive sexism. And you touched on this earlier. So what are some specific things? We like to give people tools during this type of segment. What are some specific things that women can do that would help them to adjust, to deal with, to stand tall in the midst of these type of problems and issues?
Very interesting question, Dr. Kaye. And you talked a little bit about resilience earlier, but having mentors and having champions in the field is so important, because I think one of the things that I've learned over time is that it's impossible to do this by oneself, and that you have to have a posse or a group of people who are going to literally help you to stand up, to help you to move forward in the field. And there are so many places where women of color are not, and so we do need allies who are in the STEM fields who can place you in different areas, in different arenas. And you mentioned something earlier about recognition, and I think that it's important to even talk about the media and how the media portrays women in STEM in general. So one of the biggest shows is The Big Bang Theory that's on TV. And you have people like some of the characters, Sheldon and Raj and so forth. And so when people see folks who are in engineering and science, they think that those are who the smart people are. They're not necessarily looking at people like Dr. Cross and Dr. Carter-Johnson, people like me, and say, oh, well, maybe they are smart too, and they have engineering and science degrees as well. And it's so interesting, because even when I go to conferences similar to Dr. Carter-Johnson, where she said people didn't even speak to her until a certain point, I go to conferences, and many times I will say hello to people and they won't even speak to me until they see that I'm on the program. And then all of a sudden, at the end of my talk, I'll have people who come up and say, oh, I did not know you were the keynote speaker. I didn't know that these are some of the things that you do. And in terms of even the numbers are so incredibly low. As an engineering person in engineering, my engineering degrees are in electrical engineering and speech science. And there are 27,000 engineering professors in the country, in the U.S. right now, but only 100 of them are Black women.
Did you say 100?
100.
Out of 27,000?
Out of 27,000. Only 100 are Black women. The numbers are even smaller for Latinas, and even smaller than that for Native Americans.
And so we're still talking about that. This is uncharted territory in
we're
so many
talking about
ways.
very, very, very small numbers, because we only have about 6 or 7% of people who are from underrepresented groups who are even in these fields to begin with.
So I just got a question across Twitter. I'm just going to throw it out here. But the person who tweeted me is a young mother, and this is for anyone to answer. She's a young mother, and she's trying to find out how can she get her young child. She has a daughter who's I think 3 years old is what she's saying. How can she get her daughter interested early on in STEM? And maybe I'll start with Dr. Carter-Johnson. I'll come to you first. But this idea that I think you need to catch kids early when you start talking about STEM, right? We know they're going to have English repeated over and over again, but how do you get them to love science and math early on? And I'll go with you, Dr. Carter-Johnson, then Dr. Cross and Dr. Toll. Same question. Just, what do you think we can do to get that done?
I think you have to identify your particular child's strengths and motivated strengths. And we are moving away from STEM into STEAM. Reading and math are very important. So if for that young mother with a 3-year-old, hopefully you're reading to them already. Hopefully you're counting to them. Hopefully you are letting them use the television and a tablet or whatever for educational purposes. And you're beginning to identify what that child's strengths are. And you're exposing that child to as much math as they can possibly get very early on. So what some parents don't realize is in order to major in physics or math or engineering, you need to have had calculus and physics in high school. So do whatever you can do to get your student exposed and well prepared in basic mathematics and science and English and reading, because they are important. English and reading are important in STEM as well. But get them, strong in the foundations, help them at home, do their homework with them, help them focus on academics in elementary school and middle school. And then in high school, let them take those advanced math courses, because I see so many students who think they want to major in engineering, but they haven't done well in chemistry or they haven't done well in physics. And take away the calculators and the computer. Engineering and math and science is still about writing it down, knowing the formulas, knowing how they work together. So that's kind of my recommendation.
I'll put that down. Take away the calculator and the computers. Dr. Cross, what's your recommendation?
Kate, my recommendation would be one of the things that I communicate. I think that we as a community need to start working on dispelling the fear of math and science. One of the examples that I give is that most of our kids, at some point, they play some sport. And for the sake of time, I'll just talk about basketball. And I explained that when they first learned how to play basketball, when they first became interested, they just picked up the ball, and the coach told them how to do this, and they taught them the rules, and then eventually they played in the game, right? And I would make the argument that math and engineering are the same way. Once you know the rules, and I teach you the rules, you can play.
Well,
because
I like
we're and so and just kind of adding on to Dr. Carter's point is that making it relevant. We tend to think that math and science is something outside of ourselves. So the more that we can connect it to who we are, you can have students do simple things of just counting their heartbeat, right? Their heartbeat, their heart pumping, that can be mathematically described, and that's a chemical process that's taking place. And that's something within themselves.
I like that. Mathematical process chemically described. So far, we have take away the calculator and computers. And Dr. Carter Johnson, my son, has already texted me to ignore what you just said. But take away the calculators and the computers.
Don't rely on it.
Don't rely on it.
Crutch. It's not a crutch.
Don't use it as a crutch.
As my colleague Dr. Cross said, you still have to know the rule for dividing fractions and multiplying fractions and doing all these things that your calculator can do for you. When you get to college physics and chemistry, if you don't know those rules, then you can't apply. If you've only let the calculator do it for you in math class, then now you can't apply those rules to equations in physics and chemistry.
So, Dr. Toll, I'll come to you before we take our break. Can you give us some tips? How do we get young people interested in this?
Yes. And so one of the things that I was thinking about when Dr. Carter Johnson was saying don't rely on computers and calculators, I was thinking about a game that we used to play in the car, and that is adding up license plates when you're passing on the street.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it's something, of course, you're going from place to place, and even if you're walking, you can see license plates, you can see addresses from apartments or houses, and just adding them up as you go along in your head, and teaching people to do that and encouraging them to do that. Also encouraging within our churches, within our communities, and not saying things, having negative language, like, oh, math is hard. So that was one of the things that happened with women in STEM a while ago when they had Barbie dolls that were saying, oh, math is hard and fashion is fun. And so we have to stop that even in our communities. We have to encourage students to do things in math and science and let them know that it's a good thing, and encourage them and say, oh, you're doing some math, you like science, this is fantastic. My mom and dad really encouraged me very well. When I was young, I said I wanted to be a doctor. They gave me a Grey's Anatomy book before I could even read it.
Not the television show, Grey's Anatomy with the bot.
No, right? Yes, the actual thick book. I played operation games. They gave me math coloring books when I was young, and all of those things help to facilitate. So toys, those things that are part of leisure, putting those into an academic context are really good tools.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to do kind of a round robin here with our three doctors, and we're going to talk about the 5 biases that are pushing women out of STEM. What can we do to go against that? We're going to talk about how you can get into the field, the ways that you can get the high-priced grants and fellowships, and we're going to answer some of your pressing questions. Give us a call at 410-319-8888. We have Black women talking about STEM. Today with Dr. Kaye. Stay with us. Welcome back to Today with Dr. Kaye. We are here talking about trending Tuesday topics, and we're looking at Black women in STEM. We're trying to figure out how do we get our young children, boys and girls, to be interested in the field. How can we get them excited? We have heard so many tips in our last segment where we heard things like take away the calculator and computers, have them learn how not to rely on that. We had some comments about taking advanced math classes and having your kids learn the rules and making it relevant. We also heard games that you could play, having your kids count their heartbeats or add up license plates. So I'm just so excited to get these tips and topics because we want more young boys and girls to be interested in STEM. I'm here with Dr. Renetta Toll. She's the Associate Vice Provost for Strategic Initiatives of the Graduate School at UMBC, College of Engineering and Information Technology. Thank you, Dr. Toll, for staying with us.
Thank you, Dr. Kaye.
We also have Dr. Frances Carter Johnson. She's an education data scientist. She has training in physics, mechanical engineering, policy research, evaluation. She has 3 degrees in physics, her undergraduate and 2 masters in physics. Dr. Carter Johnson, thank you for being back with us.
Thank you.
And here with Dr. Kelly Cross. She's a research scientist she's hanging out in the bioengineering department, but she's actually a chemical engineer. Is that right, Dr. Cross?
Yes, thank you for having me.
So I want to go through these 5 biases and kind of do a round robin. I want to put it out there, and I'd like you to, kind of talk about this. So the first bias that's pushing women out of STEM is they call it pattern 1, prove it again. And this came out of the Harvard Business Review, by the way. They said that 2/3 of the women interviewed and 2/3 of the women surveyed reported having to prove themselves over and over again. That no matter what they did, their successes were discounted and their expertise questioned. So what do you do to get through the prove it again theory? Dr. Cross, I'll come to you first.
I would say one of the things that I personally do, Kay, is that I actually do in my side job is actually conduct bias workshops in STEM because unfortunately, again, most of my colleagues in engineering, they're not familiar with the scholarship around bias and people that study that. This is the understanding that bias is the neurological way in which our brains work. As human beings, that's how our brain efficiently stores information. And so helping people get over the fact that we're saying that there is a bias, helping engineers actually get over that has been my approach to it. And so in terms of the systemic with women in particular in their matriculation, so even we noticed a bias even in, for example, with tenured faculty in the reports from students, that their feedback, what we call them the ISA scores, or the student at the end of the semester, the students provide feedback to the faculty member. And we've noticed in those scores and those feedback that there's a clear bias against women, and particularly women of color. And so there is, even among the students, there's this perception that women are less intelligent, and there is scholarship around that. So I try to arm myself with that scholarship and discuss it with my colleagues who will probably never read any of that scholarship.
Now, Dr. Toll, we're talking about the prove it again pattern, which is where women typically, particularly in STEM, have their successes discounted and their expertise questioned. How do you build up resiliency against that? What does that look like, really?
It's so difficult. It can be incredibly difficult, Dr. Kaye. And the old adage that we've heard growing up, that you have to be better and do better and sort of one up colleagues, unfortunately, is true. And so there are usually 2 ways that you can handle it. You can either say, I'm going to stay where I am and I'm going to just sort of fight the system. I'm going to work to move forward and just continually to try to look at what the metrics are and have more papers and go to more conferences and do things that are on a more prestigious level and see if it counts, and hope that the institution is also looking at those kinds of things and will reward one for it. But in some cases, people have to leave their current institutions and then go to a place that is actually valuing the work that they do. And so there are people who have done both things. They have stayed and tried to fight, and in some cases, over time, the women might be very tired, but they have been able to push through. Maybe they have been traumatized, but then some women in the next generation have been able to actually function and actually advance. And then other people have said, I have a life to live. My health is too important. I really can't stay and just continue to fight this fight and not have anything work in my favor. And so I'm going to leave this institution. And in some cases, it's very sad. Some people leave STEM altogether. And we think that that's the saddest piece. My husband and I have a paper that we wrote called Dark Matters. And what it is it talks about, it sort of puts physics correlates to different things that happen when people leave STEM altogether. So we look at black holes, for example, that we hear about in physics and in the universe. And then we say, well, what happens if we make a corollary and say, if a person falls into a black hole, what happens? Are they destroyed when they come out? And many times, if a person is not supported and they are not able, or they choose not to stay, and they sort of go through this black hole, they leave STEM altogether. They go into a different field. They may be very successful in that field, but STEM has lost a very intelligent person who could have contributed to the field. So we need to have structures that are set up, and infrastructure that can be set up to support the women.
Dr. Carter-Johnson, I'll go to pattern 2. This one is called the tightrope, where women need to behave in masculine ways in order to be seen as competent. But at the same time, they're expected to be feminine. So women are walking this tightrope between being masculine enough to be in the field, but being feminine enough so they still see the person as a woman. So how do you deal with that? And what does it actually look like out in the field? So this notion.
It happens.
Well,
it
no.
Happens.
Okay, good. Go ahead. It happens.
It happens just like that. We are expected to not be as aggressive. And thinking about the Harvard Business School article where a supervisor told a woman, don't talk to him like that. And what did he mean by that? Don't talk to him in an aggressive manner. And I had this happen recently for a black woman who was talking to a superior, and her inquisitiveness and aggressive questions were taken as attitude. And I encourage women in STEM, to be able to read, to learn however we can, to learn how to read personalities and understand when one can and cannot be his or her authentic self. There are some people who are really offended by aggressiveness from different groups, and I'm not saying that we don't continue to be that person. You continue to be that person as best as you can, to the full extent that you can, when you can. But I've learned to read people. I've been in situations where supervisors were not prepared for me to be as competent and as I am. Did I dial down my competence completely? No, I still had that skill. Did I completely take it to the 100% in the case when I was dealing with supervisors who were offended by it? And and I've had to encourage other people to do the same thing. It's the tightrope, it's the double bind, it's the double game that we play as minorities in a professional environment or in STEM. Sometimes we have to understand the landscape and the situation in which we're dealing, and it does require a lot of navigation and a lot of effort on our part, but I think sometimes it's what we have to do to progress and to move forward.
Well, we have a caller on the line, Dr. Renee Tintella. Thank you for joining today with Dr. Kaye.
Hi, good evening, ladies.
Good evening.
How are you today?
Thank you.
Listen, I'm calling because I'm a teacher in Baltimore City Public Schools. I have a doctorate in education, but I do not have a doctorate in science, but I teach science. And I was interested in knowing if the ladies would be interested, or can I get the information so I can reach out to them, possibly to visit my school. I teach a lot of young girls, and I just want them to be interested in this field and know that this field can take them places that they probably can't even imagine.
Oh, thank you so much. What I'd like you to do, Dr. Tantella, and thank you for calling and for your work in education. If you just send me an email, todaywithdrkaye@gmail.com, I will make sure that email gets to our panel of Black women in STEM, our Black doctors. Thank you so much. I want to come back to you, Dr. Cross, because we're talking about the tightrope here, how women have to walk this tightrope between being masculine enough to be seen as competent, but still being feminine. Dr. Cross, would you agree that there's kind of a third level of tightrope for Black women? Because thinking about race and culture and how that kind of comes into the spectrum that you're dealing with, what do you think about that?
Absolutely, Kay. And one of the things that I've introduced actually in my research is of what Dr. Carter mentioned briefly is the double bind. And I think that there is another layer of not only being a woman, but being a Black woman, but how those intersect and play with each other. So that other level, it's a very, very tricky thing. And again, there is research. I can't think of the author right now, but there was a recent article about how women have to be perceived as nice to be perceived as competent, whereas men can just be perceived as competent just by talking. And so it is a tightrope. And when I think about it from an intersectional approach, my personal approach and my personal advice is to be yourself. I am a proponent of being authentic. As I mentioned, my research focuses on education and some of the implications of the social factors of education. And so, talking about the womanist identity, showing up, saying that your Black identity is part of your learning and who you are, and you're bringing that into the learning environment. And so I think as educators, we have to think of ways to value that as opposed to trying to diminish that. We need to make it louder and say that those are not in conflict with each other.
Well, let me ask you, Dr. Toll, because I don't know if a person can effectively, check their Blackness at the door, check your gender at the door, that you want to be seen. You don't want to be too masculine, so you're not likable, but you don't want to be seen to be too feminine, so you're not competent. But trying to deal with, if I can just push what you said a little bit, Dr. Cross, the triple bind, right, of having to deal with this. What do you think for Black women in STEM in particular, and for women who are listening as well, all women, how do we deal with this triple bind? Do we just reject it altogether?
Oh, that is such a difficult question, Dr. Kaye. I think it depends on one's perspective and sometimes an experience or experiences that may dull your senses. Not everyone may agree with code switching. And so sometimes there are cases where I think as Black women going into certain spaces, we may go and try to find common ground with our counterparts from other races, other backgrounds, and try to connect there first. And many times we really try hard to connect on the side of the science and the engineering first, so that we can sort of establish that as our foundation and as our playing field. Because too often, if a woman of color walks into the room, there are people who are going to make assumptions about who you are, what you stand for, what you know, how much you can contribute to the conversation. And so that's one of the things that I think it's difficult to sort of check those things at the door. And it takes a lot of work. There's a lot of mental energy that really goes into making sure that you can try to be on an equal playing field. But one of the things that I try to do is also I talk about training the men, and I've talked about this before, and particularly with our young students, our young male students, training them to respect women and not to over-sexualize women, for example. And we're talking about that within a STEM space is something that our program has tried to do so that they recognize their own biases, that they can check their biases before they even go into a space, that they can walk into a conference, that they can walk into a classroom, that they can see a woman who is a professor and automatically think, wow, what wonderful things is she going to teach me today? What kinds of things will she be able to show me? I need to learn from her. I need to gather the things that she has to offer, as opposed to having other kinds of thoughts. So
now we have a call on the line. Hank, welcome to Today with Dr. Kaye.
Hello, how are you doing, Dr. Kaye?
I'm doing well.
My question is this, right? How come we as parents and teachers don't teach children the very things that they use scientific values of, right? Like, I have a garden in my yard, and I teach my grandson the scientific value of being able to grow his own fruits and vegetables, right? Don't teach him how to count, but what I'm saying is, his phone, use a cell phone. Sometimes you need to bring your child the cell phone, the components of the cell phone off. So you need to be abreast to this so that you can talk to your children, explain to them that alchemy is the rhythm of life, right? And if you're not using the science and alchemy, then you're pretty much going to be lost at some point in time in life.
Okay, thank you so much, Hank, for joining us. I want to bring that to you, Dr. Cross. It seems to fall into what you were saying earlier, because Hank seems to be saying, let's make it relevant for young people, taking them out into the garden and talking about the scientific value of that. This notion of relevancy, how does it then connect to this triple bind that we're talking about?
It absolutely connects. If we think about just basic what we know about learning theory, that he's exactly right. And the point that I was making is that giving them something that is tangible, connecting to something that they currently understand, that is so important to expand their learning. And that's one of the things. And I also want to take the opportunity to bring in terms of the triple bind, when you think about also class,
right.
Because engineering in particular has become very, very class. And so when you think about that, we also think about sexual orientation minorities. I have colleagues that have made the statement that, we don't have any gay students in engineering, and that's absolutely preposterous. And so those are the things, he's absolutely right, that we as parents and all of us, again, as a community, that we need to start having these conversations and thinking about, again, just the cell phone. One of the lessons that I've actually done with the high school was exactly with the cell phone, because kids are always on the cell phones, but do they actually know how they understand how they work? And they work by simple principles of diffraction, and so that's the point. Just something that they can put in their hand that they use every day, just helping them understand the science behind that actually works, how that works, and again, just connecting it to something that they know. And that's basic learning theory that we've been using in education for years. You always connect to something to prior knowledge.
Now, if you just joined us, this is Today with Dr. Kaye. And in 2012, black women took home a total of 684 STEM degrees. For white women, it was 6,777. For white men, it was 8,478. Think of that, 684. Now, we have 3 of those black women here. They may not be in that number 2012, but it's 3 black women who have degrees in STEM. Dr. Tull, Dr. Carter Johnson, and Dr. Cross talking about STEM. And Dr. Carter Johnson, I want to add what you said, really STEAM, because in addition to science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics, correct?
And reading. And some
reading.
people are doing STREAM as well, where the R is for reading.
I mean, I just wonder, Dr. Carter Johnson, now we're saying STREAM, science, technology, reading, engineering, arts, mathematics. Isn't that what the curriculum's supposed to be anyway? Science, math, reading, art. Like, that's, I thought, the foundation of what education is supposed to be about in this country. Why is this new push to kind of have all these acronyms as if we're doing something different? Are we actually doing something different?
Well, I think the difference in STEAM, to be in STEM traditionally, a lot of engineers don't like to read and write. I went to a liberal arts college, so they don't. I'm sorry, they don't. I went to the liberal arts college, and I was the engineer, the physics major, who enjoyed my English classes and my history classes and took classes like that. But a lot of my even black female colleagues didn't like to write, and then there was a thought that writing was not important if you were going to be an engineer. But as an undergrad, people didn't talk to you about the technical reports you would have to write, or if you went to get a PhD, that dissertation and those journal articles that you would have to write. So writing is very important, and basically to take that thought away that if you're technical, then you should only be technical. No, reading and writing and word problems, before you get to the calculator, do you like to do word problems? Can you decipher the steps, the mathematical steps that are being requested in a word problem? If you can't read, you can't do that.
I agree. I'm going to go to pattern 3 because Dr. Cross brought this up earlier about, we as parents, what we should be doing. There's another bias for women in STEM, and that's called the maternal wall. When professional women have children, they find themselves running into a wall. They have their commitment question, their competence question, opportunities start drying up. We are looking at it in terms of STEM, STEAM, stream, but I found that in the humanities as well, that if I go on maternity leave, then in essence, I lose a semester. That my male colleague who has a wife or a partner who stays home continues on the track. That when you get to the end, at least on the tenure track process, how far ahead are my male colleagues than me who never had to take a semester off? And for a number of women that I know, the burden of having to do child care pickup, food, putting babies to bed, even though you say it's shared, the burden of it tends to fall on the mommies that I know. So that's an additional job that you're doing in addition to what you do in the field. So bringing it back to your field, Dr. Carter-Johnson, do you see that happening? Do professional women struggle with this when they have children?
Yes, and I think it comes from sometimes families, not necessarily mine in particular. It comes from society, it comes from families, it comes from employers. There is an expectation that women either will make a choice or they should choose to not focus on their career when they have children. Being a recent mom myself, it really helps to have support, and it really helps to think about your career in terms of you will be able to continue in your career. You may not, your trajectory, your slope might not be as steep when you become a parent, but you will be able to continue progressing in your career. And you have to look at your career holistically. And sometimes this is for mothers with children or for women on the tenure track who may make alternative choices about their career. How is your career, how do you look at your career holistically? And you have to have the belief within yourself that you will get the work done that you need to get done to be successful in your career. It may not be full steam ahead at all times, but the work will get done. I also encourage students that or budding STEM professionals that there's so much work to be done in STEM. There's so much work to be done in the sciences. Find the best place for you and go do that good work, whether it be in the federal government, in the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, whether it be at a university, whether it be on the high school level, the college level, or the elementary level. There's so much work to be done. Find that area and go do that good work.
Well, we're talking now, and just one of the things that you said, Dr. Carter-Johnson, and I thank you for that, but it is about wellness. Dr. Toll, I'm coming to you because I consider myself to be a very, and maybe I can add another very, very, very driven person, and I'm sure the three of you might agree, but that in trying to do it all, where you are raising children, where you are on the tenure track or tenured or working another job, and you're on the radio, you're public intellectual, you're marching when something like Freddie Gray happens. Like, you're trying to balance it all. How do you help women in very practical ways deal with wellness? And Dr. Cross, I'm going to come to you next with the same question. Dr. Toll?
One of the things that we have been trying to do, particularly at UMBC, is change, I guess you would call it, the vocabulary, the conversation, that it's not always career-life balance, but career-life integration. And what kinds of things can we do as communities, in our case, academic communities, to make sure that all parts of a woman's life are valued and that we allow space for different things to happen. There are some organizations that are giving leave for people to take leave to do a variety of different kinds of things. So, for example, UMBC has family leave, and that family leave can be applied to men and women, but it doesn't have to be just for having children. It can be for any kind of thing that they want to do for or need to do for their families. And those kinds of things are very helpful. So again, having infrastructures that are dedicated to making sure that women will succeed, I think, are helpful. When you don't have an infrastructure that is set up that way, that's very traditional, it's very hard to try to balance and to try to do things in the way that may be the traditional status quo, and then try to do all the other kinds of things that you want to do in your life. And so having conversations that said, paying attention to mental health and mental wellness, that's something that's important. You should pay attention to that. Having self-care and taking time off for self-care, that's important. If you have vacation days, use your vacation. Go and do things that are going to be important to you and your family, and don't feel guilty about those kinds of things. And so there are conversations that have to be had. There are people who are in the hierarchy of being superiors, the bosses and so forth, who need to be able to recognize that for the people with whom they work, and making sure that those things are important. There are these conversations about the superwoman syndrome, how women have to do it all. And so we're starting to have conversations that say you don't have to do it all, and you don't have to necessarily have everything at the same time. You can do things throughout the course of your career, throughout the course of your lifetime, and still be very successful, and still feel like you haven't let down your family, or that you haven't taken care of your health. Because what good is it to try to do all these things, and then at the end people are having heart attacks, they're having strokes, and we don't want any of that to happen. We want to make sure that women are going to be strong and healthy, and be able to have their careers, but be able to take care of themselves as well. So we need to champion that.
Well, we won't have time to go through the rest of them. I just want to let people know that pattern 4 was about the tug of war, about this idea that women in STEM, once they've made it, tend to distance themselves from other women. Not always, although you have this kind of gender bias. And then the 5th pattern was around isolation, that Black and Latina women feel very isolated in the field because they're in a field where there are not many people. We will pick that up because we're going to continue with having Trending Tuesdays. And before we go and we wrap up this amazing segment, Dr. Cross, I had asked you earlier very quickly if you could give us just an answer around that notion of wellness, because I know you look at this in your work.
Absolutely. I think that's probably the first thing, is that if you can tie any of your personal values to your work, you should absolutely do that. I think also identifying institutions that support your personal values around work and life balance, and sort of those balancing those aspects of your life. And then more importantly, I think for women of color, just going back to who we are in building our village. Engineering as a discipline is not designed for you to make it alone. And I think that is even more so true for women of color, where we need to have a village that is supportive of us, around us, that we can reach out to, that we can connect with, that can understand our experience. And so I think building your village, wherever you happen to find yourself, is a way to combat this sort of balancing and how you balance in ways, and finding ways and support.
Well, thank you so much. This is our first Trending Tuesday. We will continue to look at tech topics on Tuesday. I want to thank Dr. Renetta Toll, Associate Vice Provost for Strategic Initiatives of the Graduate School. She's at UMBC's College of Engineering and Information Technology. I want to thank Dr. Frances Carter Johnson by phone. She's an education data scientist, and she's with the National Science Foundation. And I want to thank Dr. Kelly Cross, research scientist in the bioengineering department, and she's out of Illinois. If you have questions for them or you want to get in touch with them, reach out to me at todaywithdrkaye@gmail.com, and I will make sure your email gets into their hands. Today with Dr. Kaye is a production of WEAA. The show is produced by host Carsonia Wise Whitehead and producer Iore Odigizua. Our board operators are Andre Melton and Isaiah George. Our interns are Tamir Giles, Anissa Moradas, and Petra Dormond. I want you to stay tuned. Keep it right here, because Faraji Muhammad is coming up with a new show, For the Culture. It's coming up right after Today with Dr. Kaye. Our quote is from James Baldwin. Now, it is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. You can change the world. It starts with you. I challenge you to be better tomorrow than you were today. This has been Today with Dr. Kaye, right here on Public Radio, WEAA 88.9 FM, the voice of the community. Thank you for listening, Baltimore.